This summer, we decided to try something we'd never done before. We wanted to go on a hiking expedition, and the tour of Mont Blanc, we found out, is a classic when it comes to hiking.
Sécurité lors de votre descente, prenez garde à l'intervalle entre le marchepied et le quai.
We went with a local travel agency that specializes in active holidays, because they could not only book hostels and a hotel for us along the way, but also transport our luggage every day so that we only had to carry small day packs. We flew from Copenhagen to Geneva in Switzerland, and from there we took 3 trains and a bus until we finally arrived at our hotel in France. We were relieved and tired when we arrived at our hotel and jumped into a small pool with a view of the mountains. After dinner, we went for a little walk and saw, and heard, cows with bells on them, a sound that we would meet several times over the next 7 days. We had an early start the next day because that's what you do here in order not to get caught in the mountains in late afternoon or a worse evening, when the weather typically becomes a bit more unstable. It can change in a heartbeat, we were told from home, so pack rain gear and fleeces every day, but also sunscreen. We were picked up by a shuttle bus and taken to the foot of the mountains where the first day's hike began, and it began right away, on steep rocks and a winding path heading straight into the mountains. I felt so happy. In the beginning, there were quite a few of us heading up the path, but soon some distance was put between us as we all walked at different paces. As you'll see later, there were many moments when we were entirely alone up there in the mountains. But it was common to see many hikers in the morning when we were all still fit for fight. It was beautiful all around us. The air was so pure, and apart from a stream or a bird, it was blissfully quiet. A wiry elderly woman with a good spring in her step passed us, and my daughter said, "Mom, that's you when you get old." I said, "Really?" It made me happy and grateful to think that she sees me that way. Although I went trekking in the Himalayas when I was in my 20s, I haven't always been someone you would say that about. I think my need for certain activities, such as moving my body and spending time in nature, has increased as my own mortality has crept a bit closer every year. When we're younger, we think we'll live forever, and sometimes become lazy or complacent. When we get older, we know we have to seize every moment. We made a brief pit stop to fill our water bottles with fresh mountain water and go to the bathroom, the last one we saw in the mountains that day. We soon left the pleasant pastures and the going began to get tough. We didn't know how far up in the mountains we were going, or how long we still had to go, which was probably a good thing. The landscape was varied from day to day, even moment to moment. We entered new terrain several times a day. I didn't bring a proper microphone or a tripod with me, by the way. We'd eliminated all unnecessary weight from our packs, which we knew already by this time was really important. It was a way of traveling light. If we'd forgotten to bring something, it was just too bad. But as long as we planned well, it was also a relief. All we had to do was walk and be in nature. In this case, grand and awesome nature. Okay, so I have to cross a little stream here. And then in a minute, I'm going to be crossing some snow and climbing a lot afterwards again. Hey, my daughter just threw a snowball. We had a brief snack break, and then we checked our maps to make sure we followed the right signs. Every evening, I spent a long time poring over maps, making note of names of mountain passes, etc., to plan the following day's hike. Where's the path? Okay, there's an echo here, and this is pretty insane. And maybe it's slightly dangerous. I mean, look at the terrain. At about this time, we began to agree that we hadn't thought it would be this hard, this risky. When we talked to a group of 5 Danish women later who had climbed Kilimanjaro in Tanzania previously, they agreed. But on we pressed, because that's all you can do. You can't suddenly sit down and say, I don't want to go any further. There's only one way out of it, and that's through it. Putting one foot in front of the other. We lost the trail and spent a while trying to find it again. Not for the last time either. After about 6 hours of hiking uphill, the downward climb began. Something that became increasingly difficult for me as the days passed. 25 years ago, when I went trekking in the Himalayas, I developed inflammation in my knees from the downhill climbs. That pain was coming back now, and I had to take a little cocktail of painkillers before the downhill climb every day. On the second day of hiking, we had made sure to pack our rain gear because our weather app told us it would rain that day, heavily. In the morning it still looked nice, if a bit grey, so we were optimistic. I wore my hiking boots the previous day and so opted for my running shoes that day because I alternated between taking care of my knees and my feet. It wasn't perhaps the best decision that day. The rain is coming. I just get it over. A little later we had to make a pit stop and put on some of our rain gear, but it wasn't that bad yet. My daughter spent quite a bit of time documenting to her friends where she was and how far we'd come. I tried to dissuade her and just be in the now, but she insisted and said, I'm a teenager. Staying in touch with my friends is crucial. Then I remembered sulking when my parents dragged me off to the Grand Canyon at her age, so I let it be. We had a much-needed snack break. And soon after, it began to rain heavily. Bonjour. Apparently, we're in Italy now. Just crossed the border. So that's Italy. Possibly Mont Blanc. My daughter got a message on her phone. Welcome to Italy. It felt surreal that we still had reception up there in the mountains. The views were still stunning, but we were feeling increasingly deflated by this time. Our rain gear clearly wasn't good enough. Okay, it's not all that much fun anymore right now. We were exhausted, and we still had far to go. My daughter said several times, "Remind me again why you wanted us to do this?" Here I began walking backwards from time to time because my knees were screaming. We've walked 25,000 steps. I don't know if you can hear me. To say that we were ecstatic when we finally arrived at our hotel in Courmayeur is an understatement. I felt like throwing my arms around Andrea and Patrizia, the elderly Italian couple who had run the small hotel since 1972. Our luggage, once again, was there, and every day that felt like a small miracle. Our rooms were warm and cozy and full of wooden furniture, which we were beginning to understand was a typical feature of hotels and hostels in the Alps. We'd had an early start that day, something we had cursed in the morning when we had to catch the only bus to the foot of the mountains at 6:20. But now it stood us in good stead, because after a rest at the hotel, we had a bit of time to explore the little town. It was so strange to suddenly see Italian license plates and to hear Italian spoken everywhere. And Mont Blanc was now called Monte Bianco. We went to a supermarket to stock up on snacks for the next few days. We hadn't had a proper lunch and had walked nearly 30,000 steps on only a few measly snacks. In the evening, of course, we went for pizzas, something I rarely have at home, but it was the only right thing to do. When in Italy? The next day presented more small dramas, and I later dubbed the route that day the Death Route. It being Italy, things were more relaxed, and on this day, and this day only, we didn't have to leave our luggage downstairs by the reception before 8 o'clock. So we took it easy, which, as we were to learn later, we probably shouldn't have. By the time we got off the bus at the foot of the mountain where the day's climb began, it was already 10 o'clock. We took a wrong path and didn't get back on the right path until an hour later. We'd lost precious time and were already slightly fatigued. We'd read that we had to steer clear of the cows because some of them could get aggressive. We didn't find that at all, but there were no fences between them and us anyway, so we had no choice but to walk quite close to them. We saw many people biking or running in the mountains, sometimes at breakneck speed and often on trails that seemed highly unsuitable for anything but very careful hiking. But the natives here clearly didn't care. Maybe you can understand why I termed it the death route. If you placed one foot wrong, or if the wind swept you off your balance, or someone carelessly pushed you, you would roll down the mountain and to your death into the gorge below. There was no safety net in any shape or form. Here I was genuinely afraid. My smile is long gone, having been replaced by a dull stomachache. To be sure, the view was stunning, the best so far. We took a well-deserved snack break, and I thanked the Almighty that we were still alive. To think that we'd begun the day's hike all the way down there. And of course, we still had far to go. We had to cross the pass into Switzerland. Well, we're in Switzerland now. It's really windy now, so I put up this ninja-like hood, but we've just walked into Switzerland. The terrain changed again, and I was relieved to be in a safer path, for a while at least. Sheep replaced cows, and it was fun just to walk among them, to meet different animals along the way, even if they were domestic. We saw a groundhog in the distance, standing stock still. It seemed to us that we could tell we were in a different country. Switzerland lived up to its status as home to Heidi, who put the Swiss Alps on the map for me when I was a child. We had an app with a route on, which sometimes worked, sometimes not so much. It was in French, so some of our compatriots that we met almost every day had given up on it. But I was adamant to make it work. For one thing, it was the only way we could pinpoint ourselves on the map by a satellite signal and somewhat make sure that we wouldn't get lost. For another, it told us our progress in percentage, which I found kind of motivating. Also, it usually told us if we steered too far away from the trail. Until today, anyway. The day's hike ended in a village called La Folie, where we had to wait an hour for the bus. So we went into a supermarket and sat in a bus shed and waited, exhausted. When the bus finally came, it turned out to be a bit of a death ride. Not because the driver was careless, but because we were really high up and going higher all the time on very narrow roads. When we arrived in the town we thought we were going to spend the night in, we were relieved and extremely tired. But Google Maps soon told us that our hostel was 1.4 kilometers outside of town, up a mountain. By this time it was 7:30 p.m. This little extra hike was the last straw, and we ended up being too late for any real dinner, only cheese fondue. After a tough day the day before, it was a delight to begin the day's hike in lush green surroundings that reminded me of something from a fairy tale. Not cutesy, but beautiful, verdant, a little rough, epic almost. We walked along a stream and agreed that it was the most soothing sound. And we didn't meet many other hikers that morning. Switzerland somehow felt and looked a bit different, at least the terrain we walked through that day. Soon after, we were in Heidi country again for a while. Until the climb began again, but we were surprisingly less exhausted in our bodies today. The climb was still arduous, but our bodies seemed to have gotten more used to it. Then we realized that it could also be due to the heights, like when professional cyclists train for a race in the mountains, in order to make better use of their oxygen supply. Once again, we marveled at being up in these mountains, at seeing the world from up here. My fear of heights was never far away, but I had learned to live with it somehow and trust that we would be okay. Otherwise, it would have been impossible. If I hadn't still been afraid to roll down the mountain, I would have done a little dance here at the top, spun around and sung, "The hills are alive." Then began the long downhill climb again, arguably the hardest on my knees. I'd come to the realization that my walking sticks had been my best investment, even though I'd been doubtful about them. As we neared the end of that day's hike, or again what we thought was the end, we found out that we still had another 1.5 kilometers to our hostel. But this time it didn't throw us like the day before. We met the 5 Danish women that we'd met the previous days, and later the same 2 Norwegian women that we'd met and talked to every day as well. Today we walked over the pass from Switzerland and back into France. It's not every day that I walk from one country into another via a mountain pass. Except during that week, it almost was. We are now on the border between Switzerland and France. So that down there is France, and that over there is Switzerland. Breathtaking views once again. We'd been wondering almost every day if a mountain was Mont Blanc or not, and today we walked all day with it right in front of us. Before we get to our final day in the mountains, let me dwell a little on what the trip meant to us, much of which we didn't realize till we were back home again. I think my daughter did a tremendous job. Though we saw many children on day trips up a mountain, Elma at 15 was the youngest person we saw taking the full tour around Mont Blanc. I hope it gave her a sense of accomplishment. My partner had a kind of revelation in the mountains. He'd always appreciated nature, but not longingly and tearfully like me. But when we spent days just putting one foot in front of the other, with the Alps around us at all times, something happened, he said. Not only did he feel entirely present there, he also realized that there were some things at home he didn't want to spend his time on anymore. When I tried to assess what made me so happy at the very core of my being during those days, the answer was brief. I felt alive. And I too felt entirely present. When you turn a corner on some narrow path, look up and see that it's just as steep as the part you just came from, with just as many rocks, but also trees, and the smell of pine needles hits your nostrils. The only thing you can do is continue walking. You don't have to assess what it feels like, although your legs will tell you that often, but you don't have to tell yourself that this is hard. You don't have to pass judgment on the temperature. It all just is. Our last view of Mont Blanc that night was like an alpine version of the Northern Lights. I couldn't believe it. The next day I felt miserable. I had a sore throat and a fever and couldn't eat breakfast. I wavered between letting myself be carted off to the last hotel along with our luggage and pulling myself together to finish the hike properly. Also, I had been the navigator every day. I didn't feel safe leaving my family to fend for themselves in the mountains. The risk of taking a wrong turn lay at nearly every corner, despite signs. Because in order to follow the signs, you needed to have consulted maps beforehand, which, as mentioned, was how I spent every evening. In the end, after I'd taken a good dose of painkillers, I decided I couldn't handle staying cooped up in a strange hotel room all day. But would rather suffer outside, in the mountains. Despite the fever really making itself felt, especially uphill, it proved the right decision. It was as if nature itself was a healer. I thought of Thomas Mann's classic novel, The Magic Mountain, where the protagonist spends the entire lengthy novel in a sanatorium up in the Alps. Because the air there is deemed healing for both physical and psychological ailments. I can vouch for that. It was as if my very soul felt nourished by hiking in these mountains. It's one of the toughest things I've done in recent years, but also one of the most rewarding. The only downside to having been on this trip is that now I want more of that kind of thing, which is of course only a downside if it doesn't happen. So if you've been on the fence about going hiking in the Alps or something similar, consider this to be your sign that you should go for it. It was much easier to travel from Chamonix to Geneva, and a bus brought us there in an hour and 15 minutes. For once I was grateful for a freeway, mercifully placed at the foot of the mountains. A few days before we left, we read about the glaciers melting sooner than in previous years, which meant that people have been prohibited from climbing the Mont Blanc. So climate change has come to the Alps as well, which breaks my heart. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching.